Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Progressive American. I'm your host, Connor Kelly, back with another morning podcast about the week's news from a progressive perspective. Welcome back to the show. It is November 6th, 2021. Today we are discussing Donald Trump's attempts to block the January 6th Commission, Biden's climate change summit, and the Justice Department's lawsuit against Texas. With that out of the way, let's jump into the news. Donald Trump is struggling to maintain his innocence as the January 6th Commission is demanding documents from the National Archives related to Donald Trump and his administration's behavior. If the subpoena is accepted, nearly 700 pages of notes from his presidential advisors and schedules related to the planning of the January 6th insurrection will be available to the Commission. In response, former President Donald Trump is asking a judge to toss out the subpoena, arguing it violates client-attorney privilege and executive privilege, even though these documents now belong to the government and not Trump, and the fact that the National Archives wants Congress to investigate the attack per their attorneys. Now, the Washington Post is reporting that Donald Trump will likely lose this case, and the judge is inclined to throw his argument out. But when it comes to the actual arguments and the significance of those arguments, it becomes clear that Donald Trump is not trying to actually argue on the merits. What you're looking at here is a man who's desperate to avoid accountability for his rhetoric and the way in which he handled himself during January 6th. Recently, there was an expose by the Washington Post that showed not only did he disregard the safety and the well-being of the people in the Capitol, but he actively went out of his way to be jovial in the face of this massive protest, which eventually turned into a riot. So it's perhaps unsurprising that he's trying to keep these documents and any sort of planning that happened between him and the activists that went rogue on the ground from coming to light. I mean, this is a guy who's famous for avoiding consequences. This is a guy who's particularly noxious at avoiding consequences, whether drawing out lawsuits or forcing settlements. Donald Trump is famous for avoiding the consequences of his actions, but we can't afford to let that happen here. We had an attack on our democracy. We had an attack on the centerpiece of American legislative power where people died, and after the fact, people committed suicide thanks to what they saw that day. Like, this isn't some game where some congressman or representative in some small, insignificant position was involved in insider trading, which still, by the way, is completely unacceptable. This is something where you have somebody in the height of American political power creating an atmosphere that not only harmed the lives of other people, but shook our trust in the entire political system to the point where we aren't even sure if our next election will be peaceful or not. Like, consider that for a moment. You go and you vote for the candidate you want, that you, a member of the American public, want. And when you put that ballot in, when you put it in the ballot box, you are under the presumption that you will have that ballot protected. You will have peaceable protection of your voice. If you lose, you accept the results and you move on unless any evidence comes forward to the opposite effect. But now, with these conspiracy theories and these claims that Democrats are rigging elections left and right, now you are at risk of having your ballot, your right to peacefully choose your leaders, is at risk. It's suspect. And because of that suspicion and because of all that conflict, our political system, and I don't like to say this, is fundamentally at risk. Like, there are so many questions about how we are going to get out of this. How are we supposed to maintain an election without this conspiracy theory mongering spreading in the worst ways possible? So, yeah, looking at Donald Trump and what he's been doing and how he was involved in January 6th is kind of important. Any democracy is dependent upon the idea of transparency and being informed about what our leaders are doing. And yet, we still don't know what Donald Trump and his affiliates were up to in terms of their scheduling and their communications. We don't know what Lauren Boebert or any of the people around her were doing. We only know that she was tweeting out things about the locations of the Speaker of the House. This is what I'm talking about here. There is a fundamental problem with some of the Republican members of leadership, both previous and current. And when it comes to the presidency, The presidency of the United States. I, for one, think that there should be the utmost transparency, no matter how much Donald Trump and his allies would like to have the exact opposite. There should be no privilege here. The court should throw out his desire to throw out that subpoena. They should make him testify. He needs to answer for this. This is his brainchild, really. But who knows? He's a former president. He's a man with a lot of money, so chances are he'll probably get off and get away with it. In climate change news, we turn to Glasgow. Leaders worldwide have promoted the United Nations climate negotiations known as COP26 as the best way forward for our future. However, very few of the major contributors to climate change attended the conference. Neither Presidents Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, or Erdogan came to Glasgow, signifying that they might not be as invested in the project as other nations. Instead, they sent their subordinates. Despite some worries about the effectiveness or the point of this meeting, President Biden has promoted it and the United States' place in it, saying, "The United States is not only back at the table, but hopefully leading by the power of our example. I know it hasn't been the case in the past, and that's why my administration is working overtime to show that our climate commitment is in action, not words." Still, one of the most bold promises came from India, the second largest country on Earth and one of the main contributors to climate emissions. Prime Minister Narendra Modi pledged to reach net zero emissions by 2070, which climate activists have rightly criticized as taking far too long and being far too timid. Protesters outside the event, like Greta Thunberg, noted that the methods of the summit are part of the reason we are so behind when it comes to meeting climate change goal. With countless protesters behind her, Thunberg explained, quote, "It is not a secret that COP26 is a failure. It should be obvious that we cannot solve a crisis with the same methods that got us into it in the first place," unquote. Indeed, the United Nations warned that the world is on path to reach a height of 2.7 degrees Celsius increase, or 4.9 degrees Fahrenheit globally. This would put our current rate of global warming at a rate not seen in recent years, even before the Industrial Revolution. And this is kind of the issue I have too. Yes, these meetings, these discussions with other members of the world are all well and good, but fundamentally the issue is our own contributions. Yes, we can call on Russia and China and India to come out and make the necessary changes to protect our climate, and we should. This is a global issue. But when it comes to how we react to these things, how we make policy, we have to put our best foot forward. We have to actually do something. Biden's climate initiative still hasn't passed. And fundamentally, that's his responsibility as the leader of party. He is the one who they nominated to lead the party's future. Yes, he has to answer to the demands of those around him. He has to deal with the intra-party conflict. And I'm not going to deny that or say that he doesn't have problems before him that make his job extremely difficult. But that does not change that it has yet to pass. That doesn't change that the fundamental initiatives which he promised are not far enough. They are a step in the right direction, but he's still not past them. So you can't really be surprised when you have Russia and China only send their subordinates when America isn't following through with what it was promising to do. This is something that I don't want to just throw around here and say Biden's not passing this, Biden's not passing that, because that's not helpful. But when it comes to representing ourselves and actually getting people to work with you on a global level, you have to show them that they're investing their time, money, and effort in the right direction, that they're actually going to get some reciprocation. They're going to get something out of it. And unfortunately, with the current state of our policy when it comes to climate change, that's just not happening. So Thunberg is right, the protesters are right, but I don't know what the solution is here, because when I look at this, when I see someone like Manchin, who has hundreds of thousands of dollars invested and countless other investments involved in the energy industry, particularly oil and gas, it's no surprise why the Democrats haven't been able to actually get anywhere. That's where it's so frustrating, because you're looking at a political system where one man, Manchin, can fundamentally thin out a climate policy because he's invested in its failure. And that's fundamentally the problem. We have a system at home, not just on an international scale, but at home, where A handful of people with money, with influence, can stop a bill, can stop real progress because of arcane policy-making tools, because of the money involved in his or her connections, and all these other things that really get in the way of party success and human success, really. And nothing can be done about it, or at least nothing is done about it. Like, when's the last time you saw Biden actually put serious hostile pressure on Manchin to actually start voting with Biden's climate initiatives, with his investments in infrastructure? Things that we all agree are necessary for the common good of this country, and for the world, moreover. I haven't seen it. Where is it? There's just nothing there. And that's where it's mind-boggling. Like, the midterms are coming up, and as I mentioned earlier in this podcast, it's not going to be easy for Democrats to hold on, if they can hold on at all. But at the very least, when you know things are bad, you would think that that would cause you to look home and say, hey, this is a problem. This guy needs to be put under pressure. This guy needs to be in the office, and if I have to chew him out for an hour to do it, then so be it. There needs to be a bit of hardball here, and not just these empty measures where Biden talks at a summit and negotiates with a handful of dignitaries who aren't really interested in investing in these kinds of things in the first place. Like China, one of the largest polluters right next to us, is actively sending its subordinates instead of sending its president, while the world is literally heating up at a pace that we cannot sustain. While there are record floodings around the world, while climate is just failing on a fundamental level, the world powers are not doing anything. They're sending their subordinates because one of those powers can't do it at home, and then the others just don't care. So when it comes to these summits, yes, they're a good symbol, they're a good point at actually trying to reach a common goal. But first and foremost, if we want to lead, if we genuinely want to lead, we need to take the first step on our own. We need to make the investments that will make our country more secure in its climate initiatives, that builds a reputation that shows we are serious about this, and we need to stop letting rich politicians like Manchin get away with pretending like they care about jobs and other things like that while they're lining their pockets. All right, we're going to be right back after this break. We've got a great show for you all. Sit tight and hang in there. In electoral news, we turn to the Virginia gubernatorial election. With just above 50% of the vote, Greg Youngkin, the Republican candidate, has beaten his Democratic opponent, Terry McAuliffe. The loss is an upset for Democrats who won the state by 10% during Biden's run in 2020. Despite the endorsement of Governor Ralph Northam and former President Barack Obama, McAuliffe failed to get across the finish line and, through a variety of mistakes in the campaign, gave Republicans the governorship. Most presidents see their party lose their power during the midterms, so it isn't too surprising that the Biden administration is suffering some losses. However, the fact that this state went for Biden by 10% and this loss came just a year after a historic victory in 2020 means that current strategies by the Democrats are not working. Simply dismissing Republican criticisms over critical race theory or the culture war will not be enough to win an election, and simply trying to dismiss your opponent as a Trumpist is not enough to win. It's one thing to try and point out the radical nature of their politics or the impacts of their policymaking, but it is another thing entirely to just bang the Trump drum every 5 minutes. But before I go into what Democrats can learn from this, I want to go over Terry McAuliffe's electoral record. During his previous run for governor in 2013, McAuliffe won, but there's a catch. Unlike most electoral victories, McAuliffe didn't get 50% of the vote. Instead, he got 47.8% of the vote, just 2.6 points above his opponent. And then there's the Libertarian candidate who was running in the same election, and he got 6% to match that amount. In other words, if it weren't for the Libertarian candidate, McAuliffe probably wouldn't have won. He wasn't elected by a popular mandate that he could fall back on when running for a second term. If anything, his name was associated with being a veto machine, unlike most governors before him. So when he ran for office, he ran without a decent brand to work with. Combine that with Biden's declining approval rating, it isn't all too surprising that he lost, especially when he said that parents shouldn't be the ones making decisions about educational books involving racism. Now, I'm not here to just scream or shout about how McAuliffe was a terrible candidate, and it isn't all too surprising that this race destroyed him. That's part of it. But there's more to this. A lot of the media has rightfully pointed out that this shouldn't have happened in a strong political party. And they're right. But when it comes to the candidates themselves and the patterns that the party seems to emulate, I think we need to seriously take a look at what the old guard is doing. Fundamentally, this was a safe choice. Somebody who had connections to the party that they could control, that wasn't too radical, but not too loose on policy. He was the safe choice for the party, at least in their minds. But because it was fundamentally safe, because they chose McAuliffe for his connections and not necessarily for his political savvy, they ended up giving a prime opportunity to boost their position going into the midterms. What should be learned about Virginia is, number one, don't just dismiss the creative nonsense that the Republicans come up with when it comes to CRT and things like that. But number two, don't always go with the safe choice. People are looking for change in elections. They're not just looking for the status quo. They're looking for somebody who can actually invigorate them and give them a sense that things will improve, that there's an improvement in their society, that there's a process. And McAuliffe just wasn't that. I mean, he was a Clinton flunky. Like, not to just be a Jimmy Dore here screaming about the Clintons or anything like that. But fundamentally, there is a certain Clinton guard within the Democratic Party that keeps presenting itself as the savior and keeps failing. And then there's the third and perhaps most important thing. You can't always rely on a Trump-like villain to come along and give you the election. Yes, Democrats beat the last midterm in a massive display of political power. Not as much as we thought we would get, but it was certainly a display of political opposition to Donald Trump. But he's not the president anymore. And unfortunately for Democrats, and really for McAuliffe himself, blaming others or presenting them as Trumpists just does not work anymore. It can't work if that's all you've got. Now, if you find direct connections between, say, a Lauren Boebert or a Marjorie Taylor Greene, then by all means, toot the horn, scream about how much they're a Trumpist. That's perfectly fine. That'll work out great. But when you've got somebody like Youngkin who knew how to keep his distance, you can't just hit on that. You need to talk about actual policies. You need to respond to their controversies on your terms. Not just play this game of, well, there's this CRT issue and it's just censoring books. You need to actually start talking about why this outrage machine is occurring. And you need to point out that this is all BS. You need to talk about Christopher Rufo and his game of lying about CRT and how it's being spread through anti-racism training or things like that. You need to hit this head on. You can't hide around it. You can't play games. Just hit it head on. And so long as Democrats don't learn that, they're going to keep losing elections like this. So, in summary, yes, Virginia is bad, and what happened in New Jersey is, while a victory, not great for the Democratic Party. But with the time we have, limited as it may be, we can look over our previous mistakes and actually improve upon them. We can pick better candidates. We can present a new future that doesn't just go beyond screaming about social issues. We can focus on economic, structural, and real change that improves people's lives. We can focus on these issues in a way that helps people, but only if we are willing to be bold about them. We can't have McAuliffe, we can't have Clintons. We have to find something new. For our final story tonight, the Justice Department has sued Texas over its new voting laws, which it alleges disenfranchises minorities. The law in question, SB 1, added new requirements for people with language difficulties or disabilities. By requiring individuals who provide voter assistance to take the revised oath, SB 1 prohibits assisters from answering a voter's questions, explaining the voting process, paraphrasing complex language, and providing either forms of voting assistance that some qualified voters require to cast an informed and effective vote, the department said. Additionally, the law requires that if you want to get a mail-in ballot, you have to provide a driver's license, and if the information on those identifying documents doesn't match in any way with the registration, that ballot can be discarded. For the sake of argument, let's say you want a mail-in ballot, and you fail to put your voter identification number on that ballot request form. Under Texas law, your ballot request would have to be thrown out no matter what, with no follow-up required. Meaning if you made a mistake and didn't know you had to put that on there, you could reach out and still have your ballot discarded, even though they know it's you, because the state requires them to. And to add insult to injury, the law also prohibits officials from promoting mail-in ballots, even though it is perfectly legal to vote by mail. Now, it's not clear whether or not the Justice Department will win this lawsuit, but one of the things that we need to remember about these kinds of things is that there's always an agenda behind them. Whenever a state says, we need to improve election security or integrity, you should ask the question, what motivated them to make this move, to make this announcement to the public? How much time did they spend planning out every word they're going to say? How much time did they spend making their arguments for this position? Because the more you start thinking about this, the more you start to realize that these policies aren't just made to cover tracks or protect election security. They come on the heels of electoral defeat. They come under responses to things that they don't like. Republicans consistently spread conspiracy theories about mail-in ballots and the like because they knew the more people turned up, the more they voted for Democrats, especially in urban areas. So instead of appealing to the people who live in those areas, the Republican response is to restrict the value of those areas in general. So you try and restrict mail-in ballots, which in some counties were used overwhelmingly by Black Americans, or you try to restrict the early voting periods, which make it harder for people who are trying to take a day off and vote to get out there and do so. And this is precisely the goal. They're trying to restrict voting to the best of their ability because they know if things continue the way they are, Democrats will start winning. They will start appealing to groups of people that Republicans traditionally lose against. Latinos, African Americans, and Asian Americans with the rise in discrimination. So they have to try and restrict that flow. They want to keep appealing to the same people so they don't have to change their electoral strategy. Because if they have to change their electoral strategy, they have to change their policies too. And that's something that Republicans don't ever want to do. But when it comes to the department and its responses, there needs to be very clear and consistent efforts to change the way our government thinks about elections. And I don't mean, changing voting records or changing how one shows up to vote. I'm talking about how we as a society see regulating voting. In previous cases, we have seen the Supreme Court tend to lean towards the states running the elections, even though the issue at hand is a federal election or a federal position. So instead of thinking of it as a state issue in the future, there needs to be some sort of legal mechanism for the federal government to not just protect voting rights, but have a responsibility to oversee the electoral process and set a basic standard across the country. Otherwise, we can't really say that we have free and fair elections. If you don't have a national standard, it's just going to be a mess. And Texas and other states that are trying to put voter restrictions in place are further proof of that fact. I don't trust Greg Abbott, who consistently downplays masks like every other Republican, to really do what needs to be done to protect people's voter rights, especially when it will hurt his election chances when he has to run again. I don't know if there will be some chance of success. I don't know if the Justice Department will prevail in this. Like I said, previous cases have leaned towards the states' rights argument. But in the absence of such a victory, there needs to be a movement that's demanding greater legislation to protect voter rights. We campaigned on this in 2020 with Biden and his plans to put the John Lewis Act forward, but so far there isn't enough political pressure, so we need to go back to the drawing board if this lawsuit fails. And if the other ones fail, there just needs to be something that prevents this from happening, because it can't keep going on like this. We can't win an election after months and months of effort, and then Republicans come along, change the game, and call it fair. That's not democracy. That's just ridiculous. That's all for this week's episode. Thank you all for joining me. If you enjoyed the episode, feel free to share it on Twitter and Facebook and share it with your friends. If you want to see more content outside of the podcast, consider checking out the website. It is www.progressive-american.com. All of my content is there, including this podcast, newsletter, and my YouTube. If you want to see all my content or talk to me directly, you can comment there. Thanks again for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day.